This live presentation was produced in Ashland, Oregon by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. RVML relies on the support of our volunteers, members, and donors to organize and present these programs. For more information about this presentation, or to borrow, download, or purchase other recordings from our catalog, please visit our website at rvml.org.
Hi, thank you all for coming. I'm going to be sitting part of the time and standing part of the time, but it's a small group, so if you want to come forward, feel free. So as I was coming over tonight, I'm not someone who's generally afraid of public speaking. It's generally something I enjoy doing. But on the way here, I was remembering what I had been taught in a college speech class, which is that the basic formula in a talk is that you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them, right? And if you have a good opening, you want a good opening to try to catch people's attention, and then you want a good ending so people walk away with that, and kind of in between you can fudge a little if you have to. And on the way here, I was thinking about the fact that I really can't do that with this particular talk. And it's not for a lack of having notes. But it was like last week at this time, I thought I had a pretty clear sense of what I wanted to say in the talk. And then so much has happened in the past week, and so many new kind of insights started coming through that it was like every day the notes kind of shifted and changed. And at a certain point today, I realized, okay, I don't really know how to draw order out of this chaos. So I'm just going to trust that what needs to be spoken will be spoken. So instead of telling you what I'm going to tell you and then telling you and then telling you what I told you, what I'm going to do is share with you my intention and then discover along with you what I'm going to actually say and then hope that at the end, we're all more resonant with the field of truth that will strengthen us for our journeys. So my intention is to be a spokesperson for the Indigenous Soul, would be one way to put it, or for the ancestors would be a way to put it, or for the ancestral field of the soul would be a way to put it. It's something that may initially seem strange to our Western consciousness, and yet some part of us will deeply remember this knowing. And so it's to that part of us that I invite the speaking and the listening to come from. And as a part of that, I'm going to share parts of my journey, because it's been a very personal journey for me in terms of coming to this awareness. I know what we need to do before I do anything else, which is we need to take a moment to actually honor the ancestors right up front, okay, without knowing anything about that. So let's just take a moment and everyone just settle into being here. And just let your awareness drop into your heart. And as you become more present within yourself, invite into your awareness the presence of your mother and father standing behind you. And then invite their parents, your grandparents, and the great-grandparents, and the great-great-grandparents back for at least 7 generations. Inviting your family ancestors to be present with you. And taking this time to honor their presence, to honor their life, and honor what they've given you. Let's take a moment to acknowledge also the ancestors of this land that we now call Ashland. I've only recently moved here, and I suddenly yesterday realized that I didn't even know the name of the native peoples who had lived here. And when I went to the library, I discovered that in what we now call Ashland, there was a band that are called the Lower Takelma, and in the what we now call Medford lived a band called the Upper Takelma. And just take a moment to honor the ancestors of this place that we now live in. And take a moment to be aware of the earth herself, this particular place on the earth. And just see if you notice a feeling of being more present. Okay. So, where to begin in my story? I share a story because the hope in sharing one story is that there's a way in which it's every person's story. And the soul is the realm of story. Our ancestors tell stories, and the soul responds to story. And the point at which I was going to share has to do with why I'm wearing pearls. And it has to do with the fact that we can be missing something and not even know what it is we're missing. We can be hungry for something and not know what it is we're hungry for. And at one point in my journey, it became very clear to me that I was cut off from the divine feminine. And that created a hole, a lack, that was really affecting my life. And at that time, there was a book by a woman named Marion Woodman. How many people are familiar with Marion Woodman? Okay. And just know that whenever I mention a name or a book or anything, it goes with a big bow of gratitude to that person. I can't stop to pay gratitude to everyone, but just know that it comes with that. There was a point in my journey, Marion Woodman, for those of you who don't know, is a Jungian analyst. She had been an English teacher and ended up going through a profound change and opening and becoming a Jungian analyst. And her specialty was working with women with eating disorders. And as she worked with these women with eating disorders at deeper and deeper levels, what she discovered is that it really at root was because we were cut off from the divine feminine. We didn't have the inner support of feeling connected and sustained to the mother, both our personal mothers, with whom we usually had conflictual relationships, not the grandmothers, not the earth herself, not the ancestors, not the understanding of what the divine feminine even is. And the particular book by Marion Woodman that was like my Bible for a period of time was a book called Addiction to Perfection. And it's about how when you have this inner hole, then addictions, then no amount of eating or food becomes enough, or no amount of self-denial, because some eating disorders, of course, are anorexic. And so there was this profound insight as I'd read her book and then reread it and journal, and it became a great guide to this discovery of reconnecting with the feminine and reconnecting with the mothers, so to speak. And it was an extremely useful awareness. And I had the privilege of hearing her speak one time. And she said of all the dreams she'd worked with various people, men and women, she was going to pick out a dream that was kind of representative of the collective unconscious. And this is the dream. She said, in the dream, a woman is standing at the kitchen doing the dishes. And this goddess appears, and she's angry. And she says to this woman, where are your pearls? And the woman says, oh, they're upstairs. And the goddess again demands, where are your pearls? And the woman again is busy, and she's, oh, I'm sure they're upstairs someplace, you know. And the goddess suddenly in this dream holds out this beautiful strand of pearls. And she says, here are your pearls. I'll return them to you this time, but not again. And then Marion went on to give this really profound interpretation of the dream, which included the awareness that the pearls are symbolic, of course, of something precious, and specifically of the divine feminine because of the softness of the pearls. And so the pearls were representative of the divine feminine, which the women had lost and weren't even aware that we'd lost it. We were like kind of busy doing our jobs, you know, and not even aware that we had lost something precious. And the goddess was angry about this and was demanding that we pay attention, okay? And that spoke a deep truth. And I share that story because it represents that awareness that we can be hungry for something and we have to find what it is that we're truly hungry for. Because otherwise you can, you know, do all sorts of things, but if it's not the right nutrient, so to speak, it won't do any good. So years passed by and I was much more in touch with the feminine. And with that, by the way, went an awakening of an appreciation of the earth. I was living at that time in Oak Park, which is just, you know, part of the Chicago metropolitan area. And it's not an easy place to be aware of the earth and nature because, you know, you can't even see the stars and you lose track of where the moon is, and you're lucky to see the sun at times. And so it became a whole recovery of the feminine, was a whole recovery of connection to the earth, connection to the mother in terms of earth. So it was part of a very profound and ongoing awakening process. And all through those years, I was involved in deepening ways with following inner guidance. And eventually, the place I'm going to pick up the story is I'd been living for a year and a half in Western North Carolina in a spiritual community. And it was one of the happiest times in my life. And I had, you know, kind of left behind my private practice, given up my home, given away my furniture, and really thought I'd be living, you know, in this community for the rest of my life. And at a certain point, it became clear to me that it was time to move on. And it was a profound, you know, it was one of those leaps of faith that we're asked to make. Because I didn't know why I was leaving, and I certainly didn't have anything I was going back to. I knew it wasn't about going back to something. I knew it was about setting off and trusting. And it took me a while, but eventually I gathered my courage, and I got in my little Nissan Sentra and did just that. And do you know how there are times like where there are synchronicities and you see them right away, and it's like part of the guidance, and it's part of the fun, it's really, you know, it's a quick feedback. But there are other times, the deeper synchronicities, that oftentimes we don't see at the time. We only see from the perspective of having traveled the road a little further, and then if we look back, we can suddenly see things. And in preparing for this talk, I had an ongoing series like that where I started seeing parts of a pattern that I hadn't seen at the time. And so what I've said, which was consciously true, is I didn't know why I was leaving and what I was moving towards. I just knew I needed to go. But now when I look back, I can see that all the pieces were in place. And it's at this juncture that I want to share with you a small clip. Because when I look back, I can see that everything was in place. I see that I had my first experience at that time of directly experiencing a ley line of the Earth's energy field. I had a direct awareness of that ley line flowing from where I was in the hills of North Carolina to England. And much to my surprise, at that time, I made my first trip to the United Kingdom. My brother had offered to take my sister and I with him on a trip to Ireland, which is, Larkin is an Irish name. And at the time, I thought, well, no, I can't do that. I'm busy. I've got to figure out what I'm doing. And at a certain point, it hit me, oh, no, wait, I'm supposed to go. And so I made my first trip to Ireland and the UK at that time. And there were all sorts of things that happened. And just previous to my leaving, my son had been down to visit me, and we went to see the movie Amistad. How many people here have seen Amistad or remember it? Not very many, okay. Well, it's a Steven Spielberg film, and it's based on a true story about slaves that had an uprising on the ship that was bringing them from Africa to America to be sold into slavery. They had an uprising, and then later, though, they were captured and landed in New England, and their case became this very big controversy because it was right at the time previous to the outbreak of the Civil War, and it became a big thing whether or not they were property and therefore to be sold into slavery, or whether they were free and therefore to be returned to Africa. And the case was argued all the way to the Supreme Court. This is a true story. So Steven Spielberg made a movie of it, and it's a tremendous film. If you haven't seen it, I encourage you to do so. But movies are kind of the stories of our day. You know, our ancestors would gather around the fire and tell stories, right? What we tend to do is, you know, go to the movie store and rent videos and watch movies. And whatever you think of how useful that is, it is true that movies are playing that role in the collective consciousness right now. And so this is a movie minute that had a huge impact on me, and I want to share it with you. So where this scene picks up is the case has been won in the lower court, in the district court, and then appealed, and now is going to the Supreme Court. And the lawyer that's been representing the Africans knows that he's not up to the job. And he's been appealing to ex-President John Quincy Adams, who's the 5th president of the United States, and to argue the case for them. And John Quincy Adams is reluctant to do so. He's an old man, and he wants to potter with his flowers and not be bothered, basically. But at a certain point, he meets this African man, and they have this conversation, and he is moved to take the case. And the scene we're going to see is he's trying to kind of explain to Cinque, this African man, why it's going to be a difficult case, okay? So, and then there's going to be we're going to see a short segment of that, and then there's going to be a brief pause or a blank, and then I'm going to go into another segment where John Quincy Adams is arguing the case before the Supreme Court, and he now uses what he's learned from Cinque to argue the case. And I'm going to show you both these clips.
Look, I'm being honest with you. Anything less would be disrespectful. I'm telling you, I'm preparing you. I suppose I'm explaining to you that the test ahead of us is an exceptionally difficult one.
We won't be going in there alone.
Alone? Indeed not. No, we have right at our side. We have righteousness at our side. We have Mr. Baldwin over there.
I met my ancestors. I will call into the past, far back to the beginning of time, and beg them to come and help me at the judgment. I will reach back and draw them into me, and they must come, for at this moment I am the whole reason they have existed at all.
The other night I was talking with my friend Cinque, He was over at my place, and we were out in the greenhouse together. And he was explaining to me how when a member of the Mende, this is people, how when a member of the Mende encounters a situation where there appears no hope at all, he invokes his ancestors. It's tradition. See, the Mende believe that if one can summon the spirit of one's ancestors, then they have never left. And the wisdom and strength they fathered and inspired will come to his aid. James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams. We have long resisted asking you for guidance. Perhaps we have feared in doing so, we might acknowledge that our individuality, which we so revere, is not entirely our own. Perhaps we have feared an appeal to you might be taken for weakness. But we have come to understand, finally, that this is not so. We understand now. We've been made to understand. And to embrace the understanding that who we are is who we were.
Well, I don't know how that segment affected you, but I can still remember the amazement I felt sitting in the theater next to my son when that scene came on. And it still sends shivers down my spine when I see it, even though I've seen it several times now. Because it was this moment of going, wow, wouldn't it be something if you felt like you could call on your ancestors for help? I had never really considered that possibility. And as I said in the flyer, I'd never really thought of my ancestors much at all. But if I thought of them at all, to tell you the truth, I thought of it as a sense of burden. Because there was a moment, do you remember the passage in the Old Testament where it says, the sins of the fathers are passed to the children for 3 generations? And you can read that and think, oh my God, what a punitive statement of a judgmental Jehovah, you know. But there was a time in my study of Jungian psychology where the kind of light bulb went on, and I said, oh, that's a symbolic statement of a psychic truth, right? Despite your best intentions as a parent, inevitably there are issues passed on. And it can be heartbreaking, really, to see it because, you know, every parent basically wants to be a good parent. And so I had this kind of understanding more. And I'd had the understanding of what, I'm not sure even, is this Eckhart Tolle? Or Tolle? Tolle, okay. I was never sure whether you pronounce that E or not. But I recently read this book, and it has a really clear explanation of what he calls the pain body. How many, are people familiar with this book? Okay. Well, it's an awareness that I already had and that maybe many of us have had. It's certainly been out there, that we share in a collective field of experience as well. I remember one way I used to say it, it was just to be born into a woman's body is to inherit some portion of the centuries of abuse of women. Just to be born into a man's body is to inherit the experience of what it means to be used as cannon fodder or to be the hunter, the warrior. And So that was pointing to this truth, but in Eckhart Tolle's new book, he gives such a clear explanation of it that it's really brought something into focus. And he speaks very clearly. You know how we want to grow, we want to be happy, we want to, And when people say that, I always know that that's true. There is that within us that wants nothing more than to return home and to serve and to be love and all of that. But what we have to recognize is there is also that within us that resists that. If there wasn't a force resisting it, something would have given already, right? And part of his explanation for it is the pain body. And the way he describes the pain body is that anything in your life that has been too painful, too scary, too difficult to somehow fully experience, to fully, in a sense, metabolize, then what the soul does for survival is suppress that experience. And that suppression of that experience accumulates in this kind of dense field of what he calls the pain body. Does that make sense to people? I mean, it's a really graphic depiction. And what he says is that the pain body is like an organism, and the pain body feeds on pain. It feeds on drama. It feeds on negative thoughts. And so we have the experience that, despite our intention to just be a light, at some point we'll notice that there's something in us that kicks in and wants this drama or wants this pain. It's addicted or attached to this pain field that is now this dense overlay on the soul, okay? And he also talks about that the pain body isn't just individual, that there's collective pain bodies, okay? And so there's a family pain body. There's what's been passed on from generation to generation, which that New Testament quote points to. There's a collective accumulation of what he calls the pain body. So in the collective unconscious is the pain body of the divine feminine having been abused. And same with, you see that if you're born into a certain race, then you inherit the pain body of that race. If you're born into a particular nation, you inherit the pain body of that nation. And you participate it. It's like, it's an overlay, and you can feel it energetically as this dense heaviness. So does this make sense to people? Are you with me here? So that became, it's kind of like an awareness you have. You know how you have an awareness and then it gets clearer and clearer? It's like reading this book recently really made that more clear. But I don't know if I'm going to succeed in communicating this, but one of the most exciting revelations I had this morning is what happens to the pain body as you begin to honor your ancestors. So let me see if I can. So when I watch this clip, you know how I said you can be missing something and not even know you're missing it? I didn't know I was missing the ancestors. I had no awareness of that, never gave them a thought, really. But suddenly, in seeing this film, I thought, wow, wouldn't it be something? And while I was in that community, the teacher there used to say that when you heal, the healing is shared to past generations and future generations. Now, I trusted this teacher enough that when he'd say it, I'd consider the possibility, but I have to admit that I was skeptical. I didn't quite grok that. It was kind of like a good idea. I kind of hoped it was true, but I didn't have my own experience of that. And I didn't think of it in terms of the ancestors anyway. And so when I saw this film, without my knowing it at the time, it was part of this powerful confluence of energies, if you will, that then took me on this adventure. I left SFA and I made this trip to the UK, which is where all my ancestral ties lie. And I began this unexpected time. I recently moved to Ashland just a few weeks ago, kind of officially. And that's after a 9-year period of not having my own home base. So I spent 9 years from leaving SFA, getting in my car, taking off, and saying, you know, I'm just going to trust what unfolds here. And in that time, I've made 3 trips to the United Kingdom, other places as well. And I knew that part of what I was doing was connecting with the land. But it took me a while. Even, you know, it's like things happen, but you don't really get it. It took me a while before I realized, before I really had a framework, I think is what it is, that my Western mind could somehow grok. And that framework finally came to me through the work of Bert Hellinger. Okay, how many people here know Bert Hellinger? Okay, so that's good that we have this shared base of information and awareness somewhat, because there's no way I could possibly kind of fairly summarize his work. But I definitely invite you to experience it and to read and reflect on it, because it's a real shift in consciousness for sure. But in brief, what he does is, Bert Hellinger is a German. He's an elder now. I think he's in his 80s now. And he had been a priest, and he lived in Africa for 16 years with the Zulus. And at a certain point, he left the priesthood, left Africa, went back to Germany, got married, became a family therapist. And he started to, everything kind of came together, and he started to notice that any family system, like any energetic system, must seek balance. And he started to see in very direct ways that when you set up the family system or work at the level of the family soul, that people are being affected by people in the family that they've forgotten about, they have no conscious awareness of, but it's still having an impact on the family system. Does that make sense to people? And he started working very directly with the field of the family soul. And this is, you know, if you need scientific backup, you can look to people like David Bohm and his work of the implicate order and explicate order, or Rupert Sheldrake and his notion of the morphogenetic fields. There are these kind of satisfying to the Western rational mind explanation for what we discover is that the soul is a field of awareness. It's a multidimensional, interpenetrating fields. So the soul isn't just individual, and the more you work with the human psyche, the more you discover that. The deeper you go, the less personal it is, and the more collective it becomes, okay? And so what he discovered, or really rediscovered, because it really feels like it's the indigenous soul or the indigenous peoples themselves. It's what our ancestors knew and understood that somehow now is coming forth to help us. But there's this way of accessing that field. And so to do what Bert Hellinger has become well known for is you set up a constellation, you have a family member, and they have an issue. And what you do is you choose people to represent various family members. And the part of the process that just you can't grok with your mind is that when someone steps in as a representative for various family members, the field of that family soul manifests. It's like they step into that field voluntarily, and they start to be affected by it, and they start to report what they're noticing. And it becomes a way to get a graphic view of what the energetic imprint was around these various issues for people. And how many people here have actually participated in that? Because there's nothing I can say that will give you the actual depth of the experience until you experience it for yourself. But hopefully I can share enough to make you curious about it. But somehow then, this understanding and starting to go and set up family constellations and represent in other people's constellations, suddenly this whole notion of the ancestors supporting me was no longer a nice idea or wouldn't it be nice, but it was a felt reality. And it gave a depth of soul strength that had not been accessed in any other way. And I realized then I made my third trip back to England, and this time I stayed for 18 months. And I went to St. Just, Cornwall at one point and stayed there for several months. That's where my grandfather, my mother's father, was born. And I went to every part of Ireland where some of my ancestors came from. I went to Western England where some of my ancestors came from. Sometimes I knew I was going to a place my ancestors came from. Other times I didn't. I just was drawn to go there, and then later a realization would come up that yes. And the ancestors are not just personal DNA ancestors, although that is an essential, truly essential field to access. But there's also other collective levels, and there's also soul level resonances. Like for me, being in Wales, I didn't have ancestors that came from Wales, but I had had lifetime in Wales. So I had this resonance there. And there was something about going to the place of my ancestors and being on that soil that there was a gift. There was a two-way blessing. There was a blessing from me to the land and from the land to me. It was like we remembered each other. It was like the DNA remembered the dust it had come from at some point. You know, it's one of these things, again, that when you put it into words, it seems so strange. But when you start to look at the indigenous peoples and how they lived, culture after culture after culture, this is what they understood and this is what they lived. This is what they participated in. And so that strength, do you feel the strength when Cinque says, "We will not be alone, I will call on"? I mean, you feel that surge of power come through him, and it affects the attorney. He starts to feel it. Give me a moment here. And then the mystery of how a collective pain body can be transformed from a dense energy field that is a burden, where the sins of the fathers are passed, where the chain of abuse is passed on, where the human drama of feeling victimized and then looking for someone to blame and reenacting the hurt over and over again, which is how it gets passed on. The mystery and the miracle of how that can literally and actually fairly easily be transformed into a source of incredible strength. Literally like you're connected into a pipeline and there's suddenly an energy moving through is quite amazing. And this weekend I participated in a family constellation workshop facilitated by a man named Stephen Victor, came down from Eugene. And he called his work, different constellation people call it different things. What he called his was fields of grace. Fields of grace. And what you realize is, I'm trying to think how to approach this. Okay, again, knowledge of human psyche. You know how if you have a dream and there's a boogeyman chasing you and you're running, you want to escape. In the dream, if you can finally stop running and stop and turn around and face whatever creature is chasing you, what happens is that the boogeyman, or whatever you want to call it, transforms into an ally. Okay? It's a representation of this awareness that none of us want to feel pain. And so we turn away from pain. And there's a certain intelligence in that, but the fact is it's still affecting us. Okay? And how do you allow the impact of the pain that's held in the unconscious not to affect you anymore? You have to finally face it. You have to finally acknowledge it. And this is one of the books by Bert Hellinger I would recommend, is simply called Acknowledging What Is. There's a great, this notion that truth will set us free? Well, truth isn't just some abstraction or some ultimate self. Truth is also an unfolding process. So truth has to be acknowledged at every point of the journey. And simply in acknowledging it, it allows something to move. It's like abuse, the history of abuse, what abuse does is freezes things, right? That's what the pain body is what was not allowed to be felt and moved at the time and becomes frozen and dense into a pain body. Now, I've worked as a soul level healer for many years, back before I was a wanderer. And I want to read to you a very brief quote. This is from Alice Bailey in her book called Esoteric Healing. And this is what she says is the first law of healing, okay? The most basic law of healing, law number 1. All disease is the result of inhibited soul life, and that is true of all forms in all kingdoms. The art of the healer consists in releasing the soul so that its life can flow. Okay? So I had worked with that very much on the individual soul level. And I knew that in the way I had been trained, it wasn't about going in and doing anything, because you don't want to even presume that you know what needs to happen. But the trick and the absolute amazing truth is that if you simply stay present with what is and are willing to face it, to acknowledge it, simply to acknowledge it, that, to your amazement then, the inherent dynamism of being itself, the inherent nature of the soul, is to move when it's allowed to. And so when you come across those stuck or frozen places that create body armoring in the body, tension in the body, or however it manifests in a session, if you simply stay present and acknowledge it, eventually it is allowed to shift and move as it needs to. And once the movement is there, the life and the love flows. And this is what Hellinger says in the family constellation work. He says you can count on the love. You absolutely 100% trust that there is love present in any family system. And that what has happened is that there have become soul entanglements. And in that entanglement, it's like a hose being, it's like the love isn't flowing, the life force isn't flowing. There's an entanglement. But if you can, through allowing the proper movement at the family soul level to occur, there's a freeing up. And what you experience 100% without exception, no matter how tragic the circumstances that the field of the soul might be showing, is that love suddenly emerges. And do you get that? Do you get the excitement of that? Because suddenly what happens, there was some movie that was called Playing in the Fields of the Lord, and I was thinking today, wow, that was a more inspired title than I think anyone ever realized. It's like suddenly then this, what was and could appropriately be called a dense collective pain body, suddenly, when there's this allowing of movement, suddenly you realize it's a field of grace. And if you have stood in as a representative, no matter how tragic the experience of the field, when it shifts and when people find their proper place within that system, there is a profound sense of honoring. There's a deep, real sense of love, and you feel it. It's not a theoretical thing. You feel this movement of life force and energy and love, and you see it in people's faces. You see it in their bodies. And you start, so there's this sense that you're honored. You're honored for the opportunity to serve as a representative in that way. And because you're not actually a part of that family, so you're not part of the entanglement, and so you step out of it. There's no attachment, to that field, so you can step out of it. And it's a profound way in which we then help one another. It's a profound way in which we literally, for a moment, carry another person's burden. You know, my mother always used to say, one of her favorite sayings was, never judge another person until you've walked in their shoes. Well, when you serve as a representative in a family constellation, you are literally standing in someone's shoes. And nothing awakens compassion more quickly or directly. Any prior sense of judgment just can't exist once you're actually there. And so it becomes this profound way of the mutuality of exchange. And this is the important thing then. We become entangled in carrying things that aren't ours. That's part of what he sees, and we all see when you participate, that people literally, maybe something happened to your great aunt and you don't even know her, you know. But if it had a huge impact on the family system, you can be being affected by it unknowingly. That's that great insight of Freud and Jung, right? That in the unconscious, you don't have to be aware of it for it to affect you. And in fact, when you're not aware of it is when it affects you most deeply. So by bringing it into awareness, you can give back what is not yours to carry, what you've become entangled in inappropriately. And this has such profound ramifications. And the thing is, the ancestors are happy when you give that burden back. Because however their lives played out, as the ancestors are wanting to pass on blessing. You can count on that. And so you then receive that, you take it. And then the past can be passed. You know, we all know Eckhart Tolle is the advocate, right? The power of now. The only moment that exists is now. But what we also know is that the past keeps affecting the present now. That's why there's not the freshness of new life. And so you turn and you face and you honor. And this is a great insight. You know that I don't know which commandment it is, but it's one of the 10 commandments. Honor thy father and thy mother. It's like the ancients knew this. It's like it turns out it's true. It's a law of how the psyche works. If you do not and cannot honor your mother and father, honor the ancestors, honor what was passed to you, then there's a certain field of grace that just is not operable. And it's a way in which I think psychology or therapy has kind of got off on the wrong track, you know? If you get caught in this perspective of how you wanted your mother to be or how you felt about this happening or that, you know, all of those kind of things, you can have a healing intention, but all of that is a refusal to take life as it actually was passed to you. And there's a great, great power in simply acknowledging what is. And when you acknowledge what is, when you acknowledge how it actually happened, then something is freed up and the grace comes through. Does that make sense to people? And it's so exciting when you feel the shift from a heavy, dense, collective pain body to this field of grace that wants to support life here, wants to support what in the Western psyche has been called the New Jerusalem, the marriage of heaven on earth, you know, the marriage of heaven and earth. It's like that is what the ancestors also want to participate in. And years ago, would someone tell me how much time there is before the break? Okay. Years ago, I had the great honor of hearing Thomas Berry speak. He was a Passionist priest, and he became he called himself an ecologian. Instead of a theologian, he called himself an ecologian. He became quite a spokesperson at the UN for the rights of all species and the rights of the planet, and he really, as a Christian priest, took upon himself the role of looking at Christianity and the negative impact it's had on the earth, okay? He's an amazing man. If you've never heard of him, he's an ancestor to honor. But when I heard him speak, one of the things he said that's always stayed with me is he said, we have an energy crisis on the planet. And by that, he did not mean peak oil, although there is this, you know, maybe there's that level of it. But what he was pointing to, he said the real energy crisis doesn't have to do with gasoline or anything like that, right? It's always at a higher level. It's never, the real solution is never at the material level. So he said the real energy crisis on the planet is the crisis of energy of people being moved, of people having the energy, the freedom, the courage and the willingness, the feeling of capacity to do what needs to be done. And the great gift when you free up and open up to these ancestral levels is that suddenly, just as the movie portrayed, suddenly the strength of all the other struggles come through as a blessing. And you suddenly feel this awesome sense of the willingness to take your place in the human family. And I really see it, you know, sometimes there's this level of such cynicism and despair about human beings. We start to feel like the earth would be better off without us, really. You know, some people kind of cynically say that, and it points to a certain level of truth, which is the earth is the mother and we're dependent on that. But it misses the more essential truth, and it drains energy. If you're cynical about the human spirit, then how can you be inspired to participate in the human endeavor? But when you feel this meta field of the human spirit or the human heart, it's just this amazing willingness to serve, this amazing willingness to love and let the love come through. And as he said, you know, our ancestors knew that when it looks like there's no solution in sight, call on help. It's like there's so many forces of help available, and many of us on the spiritual path, we know there's spiritual help available, and that's true. But don't overlook, don't miss this level of the family soul and the human collective that frees up this capacity to feel in total awe of the human spirit, and therefore the psychic energy to participate suddenly comes forth. So we're going to take a break soon. Just take a moment, let all the words fall away. And just feel the resonance of what's present with us in this space. Not just with us, but as us. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to focus a little more specifically on the aspect of healing at these, working at these meta levels of the soul. Thank you very much. Okay. So thank you to each of you who chose and were able to stay for the next part. And what I'd like to do here, I've made a circle so that we can be somewhat more informal. I do want to give an opportunity for questions and answers, or if there's anything that really you just want to share from what came up. And then what I'd like to do is have time to share a little bit more on the specific kind of feminine part, and maybe do another guided meditation. Not guided really, but accessed, we'll say, meditation. So that's my kind of general game plan. So does anyone want to start with either a question or a comment? Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular way that you know about the lost ancestors, for instance? Like, could you have people that stand in Hellengerwer for different various people, how do you address because it's largely about
people that have been, lost to
Yes.
the family history.
So did everyone hear the question? The question of how do you address family members you don't know about or lost? That's the really humbling thing when I began this work, was realizing how little I knew, how really, really little I knew about my ancestors. And simple questions. In the Bert Hellinger work, he says there are certain issues or events, events, issues that profoundly affect a family system. And that's anyone who's been excluded from the family system, for sure. And any untimely deaths. I mean, there's certain things, I won't try to enumerate all of them, that always have a profound effect, whether or not you're conscious of them or not. And so it is humbling to realize that, many of our ancestors are Americans. People came to this country to try to escape the past in many ways. You know what I mean? It's interesting living, this is a kind of an aside, but I think this is interesting living on the west coast of America, because there's kind of at some level, in the collective psyche from Europe, going west was always the dream. If times it was like go west. Even Tolkien shows that in the Trilogy of the Rings. When the elves leave, they sail off to the west. You follow the setting sun, And so there was this movement west, and people carried from the old world, quote, to the new world, quote, this dream that this was the new Jerusalem, right? And then even once they arrived on the continent, it was the same thing. Go west, young man, go west. And there's no further west to go than here. This is it. This is the edge of the continent that carried those dreams, It's interesting to reflect on that. But back to the question of lost family members. Yes, when you set the constellation up, it's kind of like you may have forgotten them, but they haven't forgotten you. And that's why it's so helpful to actually set the constellation up. Because if all you were doing was doing a symbolic representation of what you think you already know, well, what's the usefulness of that? But when you set it up, something that you don't know or haven't seen so clearly suddenly becomes revealed from the field itself. That's the thing. So you really trust the field itself to show you what needs to happen. Now, one of the ways this seems to work is that someone is standing and representing, and their eyes are suddenly drawn downward. And that often represents someone who's dead or missing that they're focused on. That's one way the energy seems to show up. But the simple answer is that the field remembers. And it's in the honoring. It's not about having to get caught up in the past. In fact, actually, it's about letting the past be past. But that comes about through this deep acknowledgement, this remembering, and this honoring. So sometimes the movement that will be used is a bowing down. You literally bow down. And in that gesture, that movement, something suddenly shifts and is allowed to move. I did have one other thought in there someplace, but I can't think of what it is exactly right now. But anyway, so you begin to see in my own family too. I come from a family of 11 children. My mother gave birth to 11 children, not Catholic. And one of my oldest sisters died years before I was born. And to my mother's dying day, she always had a picture of Janet on the wall. And as a child, I always thought it was kind of strange in a way. Every year we had to go to her grave and put flowers there. And I didn't know her, so it didn't mean a lot to me. And yet she was always remembered. She always had a place. And that's what the ancestors want. If you look at like traditions like, say, Day of the Dead in Mexico, Halloween was the time, what we call Halloween was really the time when the ancients said, okay, the separation of between the veils of the worlds are thinnest then. And it was the day they honored the dead. And in Mexico, what they do is literally go to the cemetery and have a picnic, and you'd feed your ancestors. You know, you'd leave some food. For us, it just became tricks or treating for some candy. But there was that notion that you fed the ancestors, and that way they were peaceful, they were happy, they knew that you remembered them, that you honored them, and therefore you could receive their blessing, you know. So is there another, did that answer your, is it? Okay.
Just comment. This is the first time I've been exposed to, anyway, to this type of thing as well, Catherine. And when you went back 7 generations, all I could experience was a huge horde. A huge horde. But what I sensed was somewhere in the between 30 to 40%, and we didn't spend enough time there, were already reincarnated in other existences on the human plane. Mm-hmm. But their oversouls, their higher selves, whatever, was filling in. And so there was still a connectedness, and just like you said, they know. That's what I was experiencing. So it was, you know, everybody probably had a similar experience, whether they're conscious of it or not. And your ancestors were here en masse.
You know, another person whose work I wanted to honor was a man named Martin Prechtel. How many of you here are familiar with Martin? He wrote several books, but he wrote an amazing book called Secrets of the Talking Jaguar. So again, I'm just trying to feed you stimulation to continue the search on your own. But anyway, briefly, he's an American man with mixed ancestry, but was brought up on a reservation, so he had native blood, and reached a crisis in his life, was totally lost, and just suddenly started walking south. And he walked all the way from New Mexico to Guatemala, where very serendipitously this shaman appeared and said, "Oh, I've been waiting for you." And so he ends up living with the Mayans there in this Guatemalan village for, I think, 13 years and becomes a shaman there. And then through political circumstances in Guatemala, he and his 2 sons have to return to New Mexico. So that's a little bit about him. So anyway, he wrote this amazing book called Secrets of the Talking Jaguar, where he tries to share and honor some of what he learned living with the Mayans. And this is what he says. That is so moving to me that I want to acknowledge here, is the tribal cultures, the indigenous peoples, have pretty well already been wiped out. And unfortunately, the trend is that that's continuing. Even the indigenous people that are surviving aren't being allowed to live in their traditional ways. And you know that whole thing where you have to at least know that you're losing something or the goddess is angry? It's like we're losing something from this planet. And most of us, or many of us, don't even realize what we're losing. And so there's a need for a great acknowledgement. And what Martin Prechtel tries to address is what he calls the indigenous soul within all of us. Okay? So one of these meta fields, you know, of the interpenetrating fields of the soul can be identified as what he calls the indigenous soul. And it's a part of us that remembers and can carry forward the wisdom of these indigenous cultures. And it's a part of us, you know, it's like I said in my description, the ancestors remember an honoring relationship with the land. They understood the importance of caring for the land. And there's a tremendous value in going to places on the land where you feel a particular resonance. The place of your ancestors is going to be, for some people, a very important part, but it might be another place that for a soul level reason you have a resonance with. But to walk the earth with an awareness of love and blessing, there's an exchange of energy that goes on. The blessing is two-way. It's a blessing for the earth and it's a blessing for us. And our ancestors understood this. In the UK, we talk about ley lines. In China, they were called dragon lines. In Australia, the Aborigine people there called them song lines. And part of their tradition was the walkabout. You go and you walk on the land. You trust to be guided to where you're going to go. You trust that the land will feed you. And you sing the songs of your people as you walk the line. And by singing, there's an energetic exchange. You feed the land and the land feeds you. And it's like, even if our ancestors weren't singing the song lines, they lived in a closer relationship with the earth. And so if you feel a love for the earth and a desire to make that connection, you can call on that indigenous soul or that ancestral awareness. And, something will come through. And, these things are part of the great mystery, but they're very real, these fields. Mm-hmm.
It's easy to think about the loss in the United States due to the genocide of the native people that we've displaced. But what I've been coming to terms with also is that for all of us whose ancestors are from everywhere else, the whole rest of the planet, then in this culture that has not honored ancestors, we all have this great loss of our own ancestry. So there's this loss in our culture of collective ancestry that is just alive even in industrialized cultures like in Western Europe. Just that for some reason there's a real Frenchness in France that's so different than the Russianness in Russia. It's much harder to describe the US-ness of the United States. And so we don't have a word for it. I will almost say the Americanness of it, but it's not. That's not our name. It belongs to a continent. We're the US.
It is interesting, though. That gives me the chance to address something that I did want to. Because you know how in the film, inspired by the indigenous African man who still lived with that connection and that reality, inspired by it then, how he named the American presidents and, and all of that. And in a way, I wanted to include that because part of this disconnect, anything you're disconnected from, the blessing of that can't come through. And part of the disconnect for many of us who aren't aligned with what our government is doing in our name, right? And we feel a sense of shame for what our government is doing on our name. But it's like, do we really want to leave the field of love of one's country to the so-called moral majority? Do we want to leave so-called family values to the so-called moral majority? And somehow when you start to recognize these fields, it gives you a way to honor family values in a true way. It gives you a way to acknowledge love of country in a true way and to call on the ancestors of this country. My ancestors originally pretty much all come from the UK. But many of them came to this country very early on. They came with the Quakers to settle Pennsylvania. They were there for the Salem witch trials. My ancestors left the UK, most of them, and came early. So there's no way, it's like, I kind of feel like if I abandon this country to the moral majority, my ancestors are going to turn in their grave. You know what I mean? That whole sense of like, do we want to abandon certain things to that? And when you participate in these constellations, the depth of love for one's country, the depth of love for the land from which you come, unbelievable, unbelievable. So nationalism is a force that was progressive at one point, and now, now we all know what is progressive is to identify with the planet and be global citizens, right? But we can't do that neglecting that interpenetrating field of the ancestors where there's a love of various countries. It's like there's a way in which that has to be incorporated in. So it's a funny thing and very moving to me, therefore, to call on, like I reread, maybe this sounds funny, but I have in mind various workshops that I feel like would be useful to do, where you work with these metafields in various ways. And the main one is the field of clearing the collective unconscious of the divine feminine and how that carries all the history of abuse. That's where I feel my particular calling is. But there's a lot of other areas, and awarenesses I've had coming through recently of how it could be worked with, and one is on the national level, working with our ancestors in terms of, this country. And so I actually, it was kind of like, where's this thought coming from? I went to the library and looked up the Gettysburg Address. And when you read the Gettysburg Address, you go, Abraham Lincoln was inspired. He knew. You check it out. Get the Gettysburg Address and reread it if you haven't for a while. And you'll be blown away at the depth of wisdom that he encapsulated in those little words. And so again, what we need then is, instead of just feeling shame about our current government, we start to draw on the strength of what was also powerful in this country as well. Do you see what I'm saying? And it's a being fed then exactly to participate in becoming global citizens. So it's interesting, again, it's a whole new way of kind of approaching so many different things. It's really quite exciting, and yeah. So, anyone else? Other questions or thoughts?
I thought I'd share with you. I've done a lot of energy work. My fair share. I don't say a lot. I've done energy work, and I continue to do it. And there are several different things I do. But for the first time, I was standing in the back, and I was prompted to invoke the power of the ancient jaguar. Mm-hmm. And as I did that, I saw this jaguar come in and lay itself right over the middle of this hallway, and you were right in the heart. And I went, wow, that's really strong. And when you said that about the jaguar, I just about jumped out of my skin. I went, just once in a while, I'm left breathless. It's not usually when a big dog jumps at me. I usually punch it out, or I'm kind of fierce that way. I'm a builder. I love to build. And everything I do is kind of raucous. I tear things up. Let's go. And so I'm not usually rocked by things. But when you said that, I went, whoa.
Well, thank you for sharing, and check it out.
Yeah. I've done some ancestor work also before.
Uh-huh.
And this lady that was pretty wild and crazy, she came out to Castle Valley, Utah, where we were living. And she with another lady and my friend Elizabeth, they all came out, and they were doing energy work, as they usually do. And they're these magicians with the energy, and they just do wonderful things with energy. Well, they brought in my ancestors, and I was, like you said, I didn't realize what was going on. All of a sudden, I looked up with my third eye, and I saw most of the valley was filled with my ancestors. And I went, whoa. I didn't know it. It wasn't until later that my mom handed me my genealogy on my mother's side, and because of a certain Countess of Gloucestershire, I realized that I was related to all the kings and queens of England and Spain and Poland and Italy and all through the whole of Europe because of my Johnson line. I went, oh, okay. And I didn't know at the time when I was presented with my ancestors who they were. I just knew they were regal. Most of them were regal. And I also knew that I saw this one little guy in the back that had a jacket on, and he was real dark, and I realized that he was the one that came out of Italy, and I started connecting all kinds of things that I didn't realize before, and so when you speak, I start connecting dots like that. I start connecting dots back, and it's like you were talking about. You get this breath, you get this. There's a certain continuity and an energy that happens, and It's not like one kid told me one time, he said, haven't you checked out your genealogy? Don't you know who your ancestors were? And he says, what does it matter? We all go back to Adam anyway, so. And I thought, well, if you don't know who you are, you don't know where you're going. You don't know what's next.
Yeah, it's a prevalent awareness here, so. We'll give a chance for a couple more questions or comments, and then there's a question here.
When I was reading your bio before coming here, I had seen that you were influenced by Hellinger, Prechtel, and then Almas, was it? And I was wondering who that was and if you might address how he's influenced you.
Yeah, I ended up not addressing him directly, but Almas is an American with Middle Eastern background. He was involved in the early Enneagram work with, I don't know, it doesn't matter. Anyway, and he has developed a whole body of work and a teaching called the Diamond Heart work. And is the author of numerous works and a truly brilliant level of clarity and insight. See, one of my interests in life for a long time was transpersonal psychology. I always kind of wanted to understand people and why we do what we do. I can even see that in my family dynamics. We'd complain to my mother about my father, and she'd always say, well, you have to understand about his childhood, you know. So the impression was set early on. And so I studied a lot of, transpersonal psychology, but when I ran across Almas, it was like he doesn't synthesize, he doesn't see psychology and spirituality as separate. It's an integral understanding with such depth of insight that it's been quite staggering. And he very much addresses the soul level understanding. Not all teachers do. Some traditions emphasize much more just the transcendent or the self-realization, the unchanging self. But the soul is the level that evolves and changes and is this field of awareness. And he includes and honors that understanding. And he very much is aware that the deeper you go in the individual soul, the more collective it becomes. And there was a man named Hunter Beaumont who played a key role in introducing the Hellinger work into this country, and Hunter Beaumont also worked with the Diamond Heart work, so there's a certain overlap there, although it's, not the same. But anyway, so that's where that understanding plays in. Mm-hmm.
Could you spell his name for us?
It's Almaas. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Before I share a little more and see what we can lead into in terms of, so how much time do we have?
It was 9, but 25 minutes.
25 minutes, okay. Jean Houston used to say, you have 1 minute of clock time equal to all the time you need. So it's kind of like that. We have 25 minutes of clock time, and we'll trust that it's all the time we need for what wants to happen here. So some of this has been shared already, but I wanted to focus a little more on this particular aspect of working with clearing the collective unconscious from the centuries of the degradation and abuse of the feminine and of women. And it's not that there's not an equivalent degree of work to be done in terms of the masculine in order to honor the divine marriage, but my particular calling as a woman is definitely in alignment with the Divine Mother and the Divine Feminine. And I already shared the part of the journey about Marion Woodman. At this point, 9 years ago, I think it was, when I was about to leave and I watched this movie and made my first trip to the UK and everything, not seeing how everything was working together. At that point is when I was told by a psychic woman that I traded sessions with that she saw me working with groups of people at various sacred sites, and we danced, and as we danced, the ancestors danced with us, and hence the title of the talk, Dancing with the Ancestors. Now, I haven't really talked a lot about why dancing. You know, I don't even fully understand it, but I do have some insights into why dancing. Because, of course, indigenous peoples danced. Indigenous peoples told stories, they played music, they sang, and they danced. And those were, you know, regular collective experiences. And they lived close to the land and in a collectivity. They didn't have this emphasis on the individual that the West has developed. And so again, I haven't really fully understood or paid a lot of attention to what that means, dancing with the ancestors, although, you know, things have unfolded. And at a certain point in this third trip to the UK, when I stayed for 18 months, at one point I went to Bristol, and I participated in a family constellation workshop there led by an English woman. And I was, you know, serving as a representative in a lot of different constellations, all of which were powerful. And at this one point, this woman, briefly, her story was that she was a young woman and she was dealing with her pain and bitterness about the fact that her mother had abandoned she and her sister, and when they were quite young, and the mother had abandoned them from the extent of her own pain because she came from a large family and had been both an incest victim and physical abuse, and, you know, the whole 9 yards. It was like, you know, everything you wouldn't want to happen was there. And so this woman came and she asked me, would I represent her mother? And I said, yes, I'd be honored to. And you never know when you stand in as a representative what will happen. That's, you know, that's the whole thing. You just get out of the way and see what happens. But usually it's fairly quiet, and the movements are kind of thoughtful, slow movements. And all of a sudden in this constellation, it was like this energy took over my body, and I started dancing. I started moving, and I was not doing it. It was like literally, I was like going through these. It was quite an extraordinary experience. And not to try to belabor the whole thing, but the gist of what happened, in what I can understand, is that in that particular line, the family line was so fractured and so impacted by this other meta field of what happened in terms of the feminine, that it was like this whole lineage of women showed up. And they showed up, and there was an awareness of them calling themselves, somewhat humorously, the pain eaters. And what came through to this, you know, woman, the young woman who was being represented and whose constellation it was this fierce kind of demand, move, dance, move. And then this movement would happen, and there'd be this really fierce energy, not like at all soft and cozy, this very fierce energy demanding, move it, dance, you know. And then there'd be moments where there'd be this incredibly soft, you know, kind of feeling of the unconditional love of the Divine Mother coming through. But it would alternate back to this kind of fierce demand. And there was this moment of this intense desire that she look into the representative's eyes and see through the eyes to something else. And it was an amazing and somewhat controversial constellation. It had a profound impact on me because I realized I had been told in a meditation at some other point that there was this lineage of women that was wanting to work with and through women that were alive on the planet for healing. And in this constellation, I felt it was like a direct experience of that lineage coming through. And it included this intense emphasis on movement. Now, the issue impacting was this incredible abuse, incest and physical, and, you know. And what we know about abuse is that abuse freezes things. Okay? Anyone here familiar with patterns of abuse and how it affects? There's always a tremendous fear, a tremendous shame, because deep in the psyche is the erroneous belief that, it must have happened because you weren't worth anything else. So there's a tremendous shame, a tremendous fear, and of course a killing rage, and there's a lot of things, but I'd say fear and shame are really deep in the core of it. And what it does is it freezes. Instinctually, we have the fight or flight response, and the organism generates this fight or flight energy. But as a child, you can neither flee nor fight, and there's that freezing movement. And when you watch a deer in nature, when it freezes in that moment of alertness, then if it realizes there's no danger, you'll see the deer shake. And that's a discharge of that energy. It's a discharge of the adrenaline that came rushing into the organism ready to fight or flee. And instead of freezing in it, it only freezes for a moment and then it discharges the energy. Well, what happens in abuse patterns at both the individual and the collective level is that energy becomes frozen. When there's not the wisdom to discharge it, it literally becomes frozen. It becomes part of the armoring of the body and part of the frozenness and denseness of the pain body at whatever level. And so this first law of healing, that disease comes from lack of movement, and that the role of the healer is to facilitate the movement, okay? And so you suddenly start to see the wisdom of our elders dancing together, you know what I mean? And because there's something that comes into play that bypasses, again, the rational mind that we in the West put such a value on. So I don't, fully understand why this emphasis on dancing, but, again, it's at the earth, it's with other people, it's collective, and there's movement. And there's this awareness when the so-called pain eaters came through. Again, I use that term fairly humorously, as I think they did. But there was this awareness. They said, and this was the fierceness, this fierce compassion. It wasn't like, oh, you poor baby. It was this fierce compassion. You eat the pain or the pain eats you. And that's the metabolizing of the experience, is in a sense an eating of it. And that's, going back to that Marion Woodman working with women with eating disorders and a sense of drivenness to perfection, the addiction to perfection, however that comes out. It's a drivenness that comes from this sense of being cut off and not being able to simply rest in the lap of the mother or to rest in the beingness, the stillness of beingness itself. And instead there's this drivenness from not eating the pain, so the pain eats you. Do you see? It kind of sounds paradoxical, but, and there's that turning then, and that ability. And it's like that, what they were saying on the collective level is, you're dealing with issues that aren't really yours to deal with, and those we're happy for you to give back, but you have to be willing to give them back. You know what I mean? And I don't know, I don't understand it all rationally, but I just know what my experience is. And so there's a way in which, and when I say to women, gee, it feels like we need to work to clear the karma from, say, the witch hunts, which JL has spoken on. It's like right away women get it. They go, oh yeah, because a lot of times you come to this threshold where there's something you want to do, and this unbidden fear comes up. So we carry in that collective unconsciousness the memory that when we spoke our truth, we were burned. It's very deep about this issue for women of opening up the throat chakra and speaking the truth. So it's part of what, again, is the opportunity for healing and clearing, which we have a lot of ancestral support for doing. Does that make sense to people in some kind of non-rational way? Uh-huh. Well, in this particular, in whatever workshops I develop, we probably will dance in some way. But in this particular moment, no, we're not going to dance, but I would like to do some energy work. Uh-huh.
I was wondering, you said you've been to Europe, UK many times. Have you participated in any Druidic or Celtic rituals? Because I know they're really big over there.
No, not directly. I've read lots on the Celtic tradition and lore and visited lots of places, but I never actually, my journey there was pretty much a soul level guided thing. It wasn't so much about participating with a lot of groups for the most part, and meeting people that I knew I was connected with and going to various places, but not. And I never got to see a single crop circle, which I was disappointed about too. But I was in the area where they appear, but not when I was there. Any other questions or comments before we do a brief guided or brief meditation? So, would you like to join the circle? Or?
Well, either way, I'm okay.
Okay. All right. So someone again give me a read of how much time we have. Okay. Well, I have, Let's take a moment to this is an aside, but I was gonna fess up to the fact that I have no plan. I have no idea what we're gonna do here, And I remembered this moment at SFA when, which was a pretty wild and chaotic place in some ways, and this person was speaking to the teacher, and they were saying, and this doesn't, and all, but I trust that you have a plan, but boy, I don't see it. And the teacher just burst out laughing, and he said, if I have a plan, we're all in big trouble. So, scrap all plans and go with the flow, huh? Go with the field, I guess. Again, just drop your awareness and let yourself settle into stillness. No need or expectation, just settling into presence. And just inwardly make the request that you be aligned to the sensitivity and faculties of perception you need in order to feel what wants to happen. And what I'm noticing right now is that there's like an alignment with the feminine lineage. And you may notice it as a particular awareness along the left side of the body. You just may notice different chakras and energy centers also coming into activation. And let yourself really be aware of the chakras and the soles of the feet and the connection with the earth energy. Let yourself notice the column at the core of your being. It extends down through the body and deep, deep, anchored into the center of the earth. And notice as well how that same inner column also extends upwards. And let your heart be touched through remembrance of the mystery. Just let come into your awareness an honoring of the many wise women, the grandmothers who have served this planet. And feel that complementary alignment now through the right side, the alignment with the masculine, with the grandfathers. And all the elders that have carried wisdom in masculine form on this planet. And become sensitive to the energy in your palms of your hands and see if you can notice the flow of energy moving through. And what's wanting to happen here now is an acknowledgement of the human heart, the human spirit. And let the awareness of the planet come in. And let the human heart open to embrace the planet. Holding this beautiful blue gem of a planet in our human heart. And again, let yourself be touched by the mystery. And there is particular places on the planet that you have soul resonance with. Let your soul and the planetary soul inform you of these places of resonance. Remember the great truth that it's not so much that we live life as life lives us. And life calls all of us into service. And listen. With the ears of the soul to the heartbeat of the planet, and receive any message about how you are being called into service at this time. And while our bodies are not dancing physically, nonetheless notice the great dance that emanates from the deep stillness. Know yourself as this stillness, and be willing to follow the dance it gives rise to. Feel the human heart beating in resonance with the planetary pulse. Again, acknowledge the mystery. Release any foolish, arrogant notion that you can tie it up in a little box. But rather know you can come into alignment. And give your life in service. Feel the mutual honoring, the deep mutual honoring between the planet and the human heart, participating in this great mystery, afloat in the cosmos. And just reach out and just gently link hands with the person next to you. Go in peace. Thank you for coming. If any of you would like to be able to stay in touch, I do have a sign-up sheet back there, which of course I was too disorganized to announce earlier. But please, if you'd like to be in touch, leave me your email address or your phone number or whatever. I am just kind of settling into being here in Ashland, and I certainly look forward to future connections. And thank you very much for coming.
RVML Resource Center is a volunteer-operated federal 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. RVML is dedicated to providing easy access to a comprehensive collection of information on a variety of metaphysical, spiritual, and personal development subjects. RVML accepts and appreciates all donations. Material and monetary contributions are fully tax-deductible. This recording is not copyrighted, and permission is granted to broadcast, exhibit, or duplicate all or part of this program for non-commercial educational purposes. This live presentation was organized and presented by the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library and Event Center. For more information, please visit rvml.org.